They didn't treat their developers like numbers on a spreadsheet. They didn't treat their players as users to exploit.
A year ago, Larian CEO Sven Vinke took the stage at the Game Awards, and he told the industry basically what it needed to hear. And his words were framed as a parable. He was describing the hypothetical studio that would win the next Game of the Year award. But of course, everybody knew that he was really talking about Larian and basically saying, this is the stuff that we do, look at our Game of the Year. And throughout, he's just describing how to win and how to make something that people actually love. He goes on saying,
They knew that if you put the game and the team first, the revenue will follow. They were driven by idealism and wanted players to have fun. And they realized that if the developers didn't have fun, nobody was going to have any fun.
It was a hell of a speech. Players loved it, I loved it, everyone loved Larian. It seemed like here we had a studio that got it, that understood games as craft, not games as product, and that was actually successful by just being that good. And Vinke kinda looked like the prophet of what we could hope would be some new movement. What a difference a year makes. We now hop to the 2025 Game Awards, actually shortly after, in an interview which was done with Larian that suggested that they were, to quote from the reporting, pushing hard on generative AI. This led to a lot of headlines. To some people, this was hypocrisy of the highest order. To Sven Vinke, it was the price of being a leader in the games industry in 2025. Trust me, we have a lot to talk about today. Right now, Larian would love it if we were talking about the newly announced Divinity game. And I would love that too. It honestly does look amazing, and I kind of trust the studio. But instead, what happened is an interview with Bloomberg's Jason Schreier went rather viral. Not for the game itself, but for how they were making it. I'm now going to quote from that article. Under Vinke, Larian has been pushing hard in generative AI, although the CEO says the technology hasn't led to big gains in efficiency. So, Vinke was firm, first, that no generative AI content would be presented in the final game, referencing the like of, say, human actors and all of the writing being done by humans. But the interview suggested specific use cases within Larian's process. These were exploring ideas, fleshing out PowerPoint presentations, developing concept art, and writing placeholder text. And look, the odd bit of placeholder text, or maybe a PowerPoint presentation, yeah, sure, I think most of us wouldn't care about that too much. But developing concept art doesn't really seem like the same thing, at least to most people. Now, Jason Schreier's article noted some internal pushback in this, and I've got to presume that some of that pushback was from the sources that talked to him. But Vinke argued, quote, everyone at the company is more or less okay with the way we're using it. And the reaction to all this was immediate. The words pushing hard on generative AI spread all across the internet. Some people even said they would not be buying Divinity because to them, this was Larian engaging in the mass theft of art. There's a lot of emotion on all sides of this. You can see why people are frustrated though. I mean, say what you will about the actual tech, but most consumers' actual experience of it has been, well, slop pipes. So frustration toward Larian was widespread, and that was responded to in kind by a rather frustrated Sven Vinke. Now, it may not have hit your country or state, but what's really annoying for many of us is handing over your ID to verify your age and then having leaks happen. I mean, that happened to Discord users in October. Hackers breached their customer service provider and got away with 2.1 million government ID photos, driver's licenses, passports, the lot. That's why I use today's sponsor, Incogni. They're our way to fight back. You see, whenever data leaks like that, brokers harvest it up and they sell it on. And if you've ever wondered how spam callers get your number, it's the likes of that. Now, Incogni solves this by automating the legal work you'd otherwise have to do manually, which takes hours. And you can join at incogni.com/bellularnews with 60% off an annual plan if you use my link. And the way it works is just incredible. You have a legal right to get your data taken down. As I said, it takes hours, and it's not permanent. It can be slurped up again. Incogni scans the brokers, sends the requests, and it adds you to suppression lists automatically. And they've also added custom removals. It's a new offering from them where if you spot your info online anywhere, you just copy and paste the link to them, and their team will do whatever they can. Here's a look at my dashboard. 240 sent, 4 in progress, 236 completed, and I'm on 22 suppression lists. That is peace of mind. And remember, 60% off an annual plan at incogni.com/bellularnews. Holy fuck, guys, we're not pushing hard for or replacing concept artists with AI. That is a tweet from the man himself. And whenever the CEO of one of the most lauded companies in the industry starts swearing in public comms, yeah, things have kind of reached a boiling point. I mean, fair play, that's a way to have your tweet cut through the noise. Now, Vinka's personal statement followed one that was passed to IGN, but both basically hit similar themes. That actually they're hiring more concept artists, that they're using, quote, ML tools as, quote, additive, not a replacement for skill or craft. Sven then went further in his tweet, saying, quote, I answered that we use it to explore things. I didn't say that we use it to develop concept art. Now, there is actually some merit to his frustrations here, and that's because in the days after, his social media was full of upset replies talking about Larian using the technology. But they were often making assumptions that Larian was actually trying to replace staff. There was actually never any evidence of staff being replaced, and Sven did draw attention to how Larian is using the ML stuff for, quote, tasks that no one wants to do. These are things like animation resizing for different species in-game. There's, as an example, a similar ML tool that the World of Warcraft dev team uses to resize helmets for various different character heads. Often when it comes to the likes of character customization, people think, how the hell can the devs not do more customization? What's the deal with this? You just have to add a new set of ears. Why is it so hard to add another character race? It's just another humanoid. Unfortunately, animation and rigging, they're a real bitch. And this kind of thing is actually a really good place, I would reckon anyway, for ML-based tools. Now, as a part of all this stuff, Sven flagged up an interview from April, and this is one where he talked about these topics, but with no pushback on his comments. But there is a little bit of a difference, and his reversion to his April statement does kind of miss something. You see, he was talking about machine learning in April. He didn't talk about generative AI, which many people see as a subset of machine learning. And basically, this is one of those challenging things where it's quite hard to talk about this. It often ends up being a bit of a semantics debate. If you're, say, from a computer science background and you maybe know the more like formal definitions of these things, you may be frustrated when you see people talk about it in public. Of course, the right response to that is not to call people stupid because they don't happen to have the proprietary knowledge that you do. I think, though, it's fair to say that it's a messy field, and I really don't want to dedicate this video to just sorting out semantic arguments. I think we all know there is a core worry here, and that's the idea of Larian using, hey Gemini, give me a sword. Hey Grok, give me a lewd scene. I'm sure Grok is only happy to oblige. But there is a technical thing that is actually important here, right? So Larian are here talking about using commercial Gen AI models that are built off, quite literally, other people's work. Or, at the very least, using that work as a part of a training set for a model. Of course, that is very often without attribution or representation from the original creator. It's one of those things where people will say, well, guess what? Homo sapiens, us, we also learn via referencing other people's work, which is just what these models are doing. I think other people would say, well, you know what? Actually, sometimes the dose makes the poison. So as you can see, this whole thing is a little bit of a nightmare. But here's something that's actually quite funny on the Gen AI thing, because it, rather ironically, is also what Vinka was pushing back against being misrepresented. Basically, that Larian under him was not, quote, pushing hard to use AI, and that he hadn't said they were developing concept art with it. Now, that's a bit funny, right? You've got the man himself saying that this is not representing what I said. You've got an interview with him that seemingly runs contrary to that. So, to clear all this up, Jason Schreier decided to release his transcript of the interview and basically let us decide for ourselves. Okay, so between the transcript and Vinka's comments, I think we can find where framings of pushing hard and developing concept art come from within the actual transcript. And to put it plainly, Schreier editorialized and summarized. Now, this is a normal thing for interviews, especially ones that end up being published on websites. Often, just the raw transcript of an interview doesn't exactly make for good reading, so this is a fairly normal thing. But it doesn't necessarily contradict Vinka's claims. Basically, what we see in the transcript is that he's consistent across his statements. He says that Larian are using generative AI technology, but in very specific circumstances, and for him, it's not developing concept art. Now, the transcript also shows that he talks about the machine learning usage. These are things like whiteboxing layouts to build maps, which is something that had been discussed in April. But Jason Schreier explicitly asks him about concept art, and when he does, Vinka responds that the concept artists use the tech, quote, the same way like they would use photos, and that similarly, scripters are using it for, quote, stub dialogue. Essentially, that's notes placed in game scenes to just tell a writer where dialogue should go later. And in both cases for Vinka, this really doesn't seem to count as part of development because it's not the sort of thing that is included in the final product. Of course, if you're in the digital art space, and maybe you're thinking about the whole talk about is Photoshop cheating? Is photo bashing real art? All of those discussions that were being had like 20 years ago, you're probably, remembering some of those. I think potentially the difference here, though, is that with the modern image model, you can kind of just generate whatever thing you want to photobash with. But the nuances of that aren't the core point of this video. I think it's safe to say, though, that other people would disagree with Vinka's framing. I mean, that much is obvious from some of the replies. Basically, for the generated art, the argument is that it's akin to just searching for photos or searching for references online. In basic terms, that's not wrong. If you need to see an image of a sword, then an image model can generate you a sword. Except, though, I would say that sometimes the point of doing research is to build up a bank of references and to learn things as you do that. That's one of the ways artists learn from each other. And of course, gone wrong, it's, well, one of the ways where someone's work can accidentally end up in a build of Marathon and, spark a humongous controversy. That story. But there are other downsides in even the Gen AI case. As an example, maybe you're pulling up a search for a sword, and that doesn't work out in the long run when you just end up making concept art that's just Andriel, Flame of the West, and people don't notice it until later, because maybe the thing that the model gave you is eerily close to some other thing that someone's already made that you just don't happen to be aware of. Then with the stub dialogue, industry writers bristled as well. They've already got to work around the limitations of where the story has got to fit into an existing level or scene via placeholders, rather than being able to work as collaboratively with the rest of their team as they really should. That's one of the reasons, by the way, where quite often game narratives end up being very disappointing indeed. Thankfully, not with Larian, but I think you take the point. But in the perspective of those writers, the Gen AI usage would now mean that those stubs would kind of be updated as well, right? Continually done with the AI stuff. And of course, if you're just generating these mock lines instead of a clear, placeholder that's from you, a writer, do you end up having placeholder text that looks like a completed line? That can be a problem. Because Larian aren't planning on letting the generated content into the final game, right? That's a good plan, but we've got ample evidence of that plan not exactly working out well with other companies. So, there's a bit of a discrepancy then in how Vinka sees Larian using this tech, which is how he can basically argue about development here. But there is another side to this, another bit we haven't touched yet. Why would Schreier suggest that Larian have been, quote, pushing hard on it? Because that's quite the claim. To many, it would be alarming, and those words are one of the reasons why this story took off the way that it did. They're emotionally resonant, and obviously, Sven felt them as well. I mean, he mentioned them in his tweet. So, is Jason just making that up? Or is he actually basing it on something? The answer to our question lies in the second half of this sentence, which is a quote from Sven. The technology hasn't led to big gains in efficiency. So, no benefit, he says so himself. It seems none of these processes have made developing their game faster or better in a major way. Of course, Vinka argued everyone at the company is more or less okay with the way that we're using it. That's an easier statement to make, of course, well, when you're the guy who owns the company and pays the wages. Now, when you look through the interview transcript, Schreier even gives him a chance to acknowledge the public's stance on the technology as being poisonous to some, and audiences often not liking it. I mean, we have a recent survey of up to 85% of gamers feeling negative about it. And to that, he simply says that that kind of argument and skepticism existed for any work that's been automated. But if the audience dislikes it, and the results don't support the usage on a material level, of course, the way that he talked about them not seeing major benefits from it, then why keep going? Well, this is where it gets a bit more uncomfortable. He's very, very explicit, and here is what he would go on to say. Quote, "This is a tech-driven industry, so you try stuff. You can't afford not to try things, because if someone finds the golden egg and you're not using it, you're dead. in this industry. So basically, there it is, folks. There's no major benefit currently with where the tech is right now. There is a lot of audience hostility, but it is continuing. And in this case, it's continuing with Larian because Vinka simply believes that stopping could be suicide. Someone might crack it. It might be huge. And if Larian isn't ready, they're dead. I mean, those words sound so dramatic when they come out of my mouth, but go back to his quote. He did say, "You're dead in this industry." Yeah, I don't know, man. I think given the quality of the games they make, without any of this stuff, they'd probably be the last to be dead in this industry. I mean, this is a man who stood on stage in 2024 and said, quote, "They were driven by idealism." Of course, in a way, talking about themselves. And now he is kind of telling us that idealism has limits, you know? That as much as they could be doing all of the great things talked about in 2024, that if the Gen AI stuff ends up being the golden egg, then, well, they'd be dead if they weren't ready to adapt. Now, I do think there is actually a grain of truth in that, right? I understand that. And if you're running a business, you do actually need to know what's coming around the corner. But obviously, the way that this has came out has been really messy, and I think a lot of those nuances have been lost. But I would say, though, Larian is not a trapped studio. They're actually staffing up. They're not cutting. They don't have public shareholders to demand efficiency gains, or an investor to eat them alive if they don't have an AI story that they can spin. I mean, they just made Baldur's Gate 3 the traditional way, and it sold tens of millions of copies. So if any studio can afford to ignore the Gen AI stuff at this point, it probably is Larian. And yet we see Vinka talk about it like, to a degree, survival depends on it. That's the thing that feels like pushing hard, which is how Jason sort of surmised it. Personally, I need to know more about how it's actually used at the studio on a day-to-day level to actually understand. I mean, if the vast majority of it is just grunt work that most people hate doing, the sort of thing that is kind of thoughtless, then I don't really mind that much. If it's on the creative side, then I do start to get really, really concerned. As to whether that's pushing hard or not is up to you. But I will say, I don't think this feels like the cool confidence of Larian's 2024 Game Awards speech, and you can make of that what you will. But this video is not done yet, because even if we're just doing a few placeholders, well, it turns out that's not always what actually makes it live. Recently, Call of Duty and Anno were also games that weren't meant to have generative AI in the final product, and yet it was there in the final product and had to be stripped out later. Just like with the Expedition 33 poster, and by the way, it also had its own AI-related drama in and around the time of the Game Awards. Now Larian are basically saying a similar thing though, that this tech is only getting used in those pre-production stages, that staff are more or less okay with how it's being used, and that it'll never make it to the final release. And I certainly trust Larian more than a lot of those other studios. But we have heard similar. We're hearing it again now, and it hasn't always worked out that way. And I think for a lot of people, it feels like a bit of a betrayal because Larian built their reputation on being different. I think that's the bit that is stinging, at least for the people who are really angry about this story. It's not just that it's a studio using a tool that people dislike. I mean, come on, it rains, the sky's blue. No, it's that Larian are using it. It's that the studio that stood on the stage and told everyone else how to do things right are also using this stuff and exploring this stuff. And remember, Baldur's Gate 3 is a game that has superfans. Larian is a studio that has superfans. It will feel personal. So if you've even looked at this and thought, they're obviously not as bad as these other studios, come on, why is everyone so angry? Well, it's because of what the studio means to many of those people. Now, Larian, I expect, would just want this whole thing to blow over. There was a final statement from Vinka before Christmas that hinted at conciliation, explaining that, quote, where processes are not efficient or fail to align with who they are, that they would be changed, which is a far enough cry from the interview transcript. They're also planning to host an AMA where staff from different departments will talk through their processes. And you know what? I'm genuinely fascinated. I want to see what's going on there. I want to see what's the ML tool that's able to resize armor to fit different characters, or something that just solves grunt work. The type of thing that, unless you were, I don't know, like in development, you probably wouldn't even know is a part of the process. Now, whether or not this will be enough to close the audience perception gap between, say, the Vinca that stood on stage in 2024 and the Vinca that sat down with Bloomberg in 2025, I don't know. But what I do know is that is the question that Larian still needs to answer. Whew, what a story. I would love to hear your take on this one. And, well, if you want another story of, I guess, internal processes not going well, you should really look at what's going on in Naughty Dog. And the good news is, we've done a full report on it, which you can watch next.